Okay, so the next lesson that we're looking at for this part of the topic is on the abolitionists themselves. So this is looking at the people who were actually involved, and in particular, probably one of the most important names that we will look at in this part of the topic is William Wilberforce. He was the kind of the mouthpiece of the abolitionists. He's the one that took it to Parliament. He was an MP. He was the one that kind of forced through the bill every time for quite a lot of his political career. And then when we're thinking about abolitionists who are responsible for the end of the slave trade, he tends to be the one that most historians argue is the most influential and probably therefore the most important. However, there are other people involved as well. It wasn't kind of a one-man show, and we're thinking about the rest of them as well. So by the end of this part, what we really need for you to be able to do is explain what William Wilberforce actually did in the slave trade, and to maybe able to explain some of the other abolitionists. We're also going to have a look at another 2 National 5 skills for this particular part of the topic, which is going to be the mini essay skill again, which I know that you've just recently done, but we're going to look at it again because it's quite a common question to get, and we're going to have a look at a how fully question. So just as a kind of a wee recap and a kind of thought about reasons why the slave trade started to become less of a thing, things that people were starting to turn against. Okay, these are the main arguments that the abolitionist groups, so these ones that we sort of looked at starting to develop from these 5 main reasons, were actually using. So these are the things that they would argue against the slave trade in public, at meetings, in their petitions to Parliament, even sometimes in Parliament meetings as well. So the first thing, obviously, we're thinking about the religious groups. Okay, they were opposed to the trade on the grounds that it was against God's will. They saw slavery as morally wrong. It was unjust to treat these people this way, and even some of them, like the Quakers for example, went as far as saying it was completely evil. A lot of them thought that with this religious revival, that if they continued in with slavery, they were going to find themselves being punished by God. And some of the people that we're going to be looking at here, in particular a man called John Newton, he really was an advocate of this. He preached that God would be punishing those who were involved in slavery. Also, remember we said that the slave trade was something that was profitable. It's about making money, and the reality was it starts to become less profitable. It's cheaper to buy the white gold, the key good sugar, from places like Brazil or Cuba, okay, or even things like India, where it was being grown by people who were being paid. You don't have the fear of revolt and things there. These people are actually willing to work for their money, and the sugar then coming from there ultimately works out cheaper because you're not having to continuously replace the slaves or the damage that they may be doing or anything like that. People also started to argue that actually the slaves would work harder if they were freed and they were paid. Again, they're using this example from these workers in India. They're not being paid an awful lot, but they are being paid, and they're quite happy to work and to grow the crops. So if it was working there, and it's working for some slave owners who have actually started to do this, then maybe it would actually just be fine to do that for everybody. Obviously, we've got a high death rate amongst the slaves. Realistically, most slaves will only last about 7 to 9 years of hard labour in the plantations, and then they'll die and they'll need to be replaced. So it makes it more difficult for you to maintain a workforce, so you can't actually grow as much crop as you would maybe want to be able to grow, and it's actually quite expensive because you're having to continuously replace these slaves. Also, by this point, Britain has a much better trade connection with other parts of the world. So for example, Australia, they don't actually need any of these kind of manufactured goods sales to Africa anymore. They're able to use other places. They've got better trade routes and things, so they don't actually need just the West Indies or Africa in this triangular trade. They've got broader horizons, more things to do. Obviously, we now are seeing more evidence of the cruel treatment. Now, in particular, a man called ThomasClarkson was really important with this. He showed that the slaves were actually being treated really badly. Their experiences were very negative. He had testimonies from escaped slaves or from freed slaves like Olad Equiano, and he had the case of the Zong, which was able to bring huge publicity to the abolitionist cause because it made people see what the slaves were actually going through. And again, back to this humanitarian idea, they started to see this as really cruel and evil, and again it was against their religious beliefs to treat people as such, so they start to think that this is not a good way forward, and the slave trade starts to lose some support. Obviously the plantation owners were really worried about this constant threat of revolution and rebellion from the slaves, so the argument was just get rid of it then, and then that way they would never have to worry about it. There's a lot of death from slaves and from sailors on the Middle Passage, especially at that particular point, but the rest of the triangular trade is not safe either. Really good case is the Armistad, which was a ship that set sail in 1839 from Britain, and it lost quite a high number of both slaves and sailors due to storms and things like that, so it wasn't a particularly safe job to do. And as more and more people are starting to see that there are other jobs to do in Britain, this becomes less of a thing that they actually want to do. Obviously, it means that there's a lot of wars as well being caused in Africa still. African development is kind of stunted. We talked about this idea of it not being able to grow and develop as well as it possibly should be. There's a lot of wars because obviously they're supplying weapons, and Britain start to feel a little bit guilty about this. They feel quite responsible, and the question starts to become, do we want to be responsible for what will ultimately become a very stunted warlike nation that potentially could be a threat in future or could potentially no longer exist in the way that it should? And a lot of people don't actually really want to be responsible for that. They would rather just ignore it and pretend it wasn't there. So these things are all really the main arguments that are used by these abolitionists against the slave trade that we talked about in the last lesson, kind of just summarised for you in a wee bit more detail. So best thing to do now would be to make a copy of this table in your jotter. Make sure you put the heading. Don't obviously copy everything word from word in each of your boxes, but just kind of summarise the key points that you actually need to explain the arguments that were used against the slave trade. You can pause the video for a couple of minutes if you want while you're doing that, and then we'll move on a little bit. So in theory, now that you've got your table put in, if you haven't, go back and actually do the table. We're now thinking about the abolitionists themselves. Who are these people that are taking these arguments that we've just summarised into our table forward? Now, like we said, the main one is William Wilberforce. Okay, he's going to be our key speaker, but there are other people involved. Granville Sharp, another famous name. Thomas Clarkson, again, he's our evidence man. John Newton, who I briefly mentioned and I'll talk about in more detail. Olad Equiano, who we have talked about throughout the topic, an ex-slave. Josiah Wedgwood, who again is going to be really important for one element of the abolition campaign that he does. James Ramsey, and finally Hanna Mer. So these 8 people are the ones that we're really going to focus on. What we're going to do as we go through the next little bit of information, okay, we're going to make a fact file grid for each person on the list. Now, if you're not a grid person, you can do this as a mind map. Take one page for each of the 8 people and put their name in the centre, and then you can write the information around about it. If you're not a grid or a mind map person, then feel free just to put it as a little fact file. So you could put the person's name, maybe in a colour, and then some bullet points of information underneath them. If you really want, you can make some little booklets if you've got some paper and things at home, and you can have one for each one, and you can maybe go and get some images and things from the internet and print them out and put them in. It's entirely up to you what you do, but pick a method that works best for you, and we'll look through each bit of information. So the first thing that we're looking at is the role of William Wilberforce in the abolition of the slave trade. So William Wilberforce was born in Hull in 1789. He was quite a wealthy young man, obviously when he was born, he was the friend of a man called William Pitt, the younger, who would eventually become Prime Minister. They met while they were at Cambridge University, so he was a very well-educated person. He became a Member of Parliament for Hull in 1780, and then later he became a Member of Parliament for Yorkshire as well. Roughly about 1784, he had a religious kind of awakening. Okay, he had been the son of a wealthy merchant, and though religion had been important to him as a young man, as he'd grown older, he didn't actually really follow his religion, or his religious upbringing at this point in time. He was more of a political sort of career person. He was quite an eloquent speaker, and he found himself to be quite popular in politics. So he was a Conservative supporter, and roughly about 4 years after he joined the Conservative Party and became a Member of Parliament, he converted to a new religious practice. In this kind of branch of Christianity, there was a real sort of focus on the needs of the poor, on social reform, and particularly on improving factory conditions within Britain. So he got involved in quite a lot of potential general things to help the poor, to help the kind of the unemployed, anything like that. Anything that he could do that could make him feel connected to God. He felt like it was his mission that God had put him on earth to do, was to try and help improve the lives of as many people as he could within these different groups of society. So a few years after this, as he starts to become more and more involved in these particular charitable organisations, he starts to set up his own. He opens his home, big house that he obviously doesn't use as much as an adult, and he has people come and feeds them there. He takes in stray animals and things like that. He starts to make a name for himself as a more, we'll call it a more kind-hearted political voice. And because he was quite witty and he was obviously well known now to be involved in this charity work, the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, this group that was made up of the Quakers and some others, decided that they were going to approach him to ask him to become their representative in the House of Commons. Someone that could represent the group and take through any petitions and things like that, so that they would have a political voice, which is something that they were desperately lacking at that point in time. Now, in response to this, Wilberforce actually says, "I feel the great importance of the subject, and I think myself unequal to the task allocated to me, but yet I will not positive decline it." Basically, he doesn't think it's right for him initially, but he decides that he will actually do so. He will represent them. And eventually what actually happens, he becomes the leader of this particular group for the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. So from 1789 onwards, he introduces bills through Parliament every year to ban slavery. It is not an easy thing for him to do. He is met by a lot of fierce opposition. A lot of MPs, obviously at this point in time, have connections to the slave trade. They are very much involved in it. They do not want it to end because it would mean that they would lose quite a lot of money, a substantial amount of money in fact for some of them. Some of them have actually only become MPs because they have been involved in the slave trade, so they obviously don't want that to go away because they would maybe lose their seats within Parliament. MPs at this time don't actually get paid, so in order for you to be an MP you have to be quite wealthy. If the slave trade was your only method of actually getting money, you're definitely not going to want that to end. During the very first attempt where he brings forward this bill to ban slavery completely, he loses the vote by 88 to end it, to 163 to keep it. So this is quite disheartening, obviously, because it means that they have lost. But what it does tell him is that there are some people who are starting to reconsider all of these reasons that we've talked about, why slavery is not a good thing. They're starting to think that maybe they're right. And it's maybe not quite there yet, but if he continues pushing forward, he will actually maybe try to change more people's minds, and eventually he'll be able to get the bill through. One tactic that he actually uses to change people's minds was to actually show them as much as he could about how slavery was affecting the people, the true horrors of it. So one of the things he did was he took groups of people on board slave ships without telling them what it was that was going on. They were just going to visit a ship, and he purposely did it at a time where the ship had come back from doing a slave run but had not actually been cleaned out yet. So they could actually see for themselves the blood and the sort of the mess that had been left on the hold, on the manacles and things like that. They could smell the slave ship and actually experience that firsthand. And he would obviously point out that this was after a period of time where the slave ship had been empty. So the slave smell was actually worse during the time where there was more actual live bodies and things in that. He had a model slave ship made, which you can see in the picture there, which he brought into Parliament, and he actually did this to show how small the spaces that the slaves were being transported actually in. He actually then also sometimes, with ThomasClarkson, would bring manacles, would bring other evidence, including a box, which was designed to actually simulate the amount of space you would have in a slave ship, and people could actually get in the box and see how much room they would have. He was basically making them very aware that these things that they didn't think about for the slaves journeying across the Middle Passage were actually some of the worst conditions that had ever been seen in human history. This actually starts to help convince people to try and come towards the slave ship view. Don't know if people have seen it, but we will be watching it shortly. The film Amazing Grace, which was released in 2006, is showing you Wilberforce's journey in the campaign to end the slave trade, but we will look at that in a little bit more detail. So ultimately, for 18 years, William Wilberforce continued to fight for slave abolition in Parliament. He introduced anti-slavery motions in Parliament, he introduced bills yearly, sort of an annual thing, he gave anti-slave speeches, he brought evidence, and every single time he continued to be met with this fierce opposition by other MPs, obviously the ones that had made their fortune, and they used a lot of different tricks to try and discredit his work or delay his work. Because he was involved with ThomasClarkson, who they saw as a rebel rouser, he tended to lose a little bit of his credibility there. Eventually, obviously, the influence of other abolitionists, in particular Clarkson and John Newton, convinces Wilberforce that he has to do something different. He has to keep going. So he gathered all of the evidence together and he kept pushing through for these 18 years before eventually they were successful in getting an anti-slavery abolition bill passed in Parliament. So this slide just gives you a wee bit more information that you can actually use to help you fill in your fact file. We've kind of talked through each of the points. You can pause it and use that to help you, but for this one I have given you some information. So for William Wilberforce, we've said that the group called the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade asked him to lobby or represent them in Parliament. He introduced these anti-slavery bills for a number of years between 1791 and 1907 until it was eventually passed. He used the influence he did have with his friend, who was the Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger, to try and get support in Parliament. He used evidence that other abolitionists like Clarkson had gathered to persuade people, like using thumbscrews, chains and things like that. He did consider leaving Parliament, we said, originally when he went through this religious conversion, but he decided that the best way to serve God would be to be involved with these social reforms and things like that, and that the slave trade was probably the best thing he could do. He asked Josiah Wedgwood, which we'll come back to make a seal for the abolition of the slave trade. His speeches brought a great deal of publicity to the cause of the abolition, and eventually he was successful in ending abolition in 1807 with 283 votes in favour and only 16 votes against. So the next one that we're going to look at is the role of Granville Sharp. So again, either draw your grid in, draw your mind map, or if you're doing a fact file, put Granville Sharp's name and we'll have a look at the details for him. So Granville Sharp is quite an interesting one. He was a civil servant living in London, very religious. He was born in Durham in 1735. Along with his brother, he helped a slave called Jonathan Strong secure his freedom by taking Strong's owner to court. Now this is probably one of the very first ever court cases involved in a sort of a white person representing a black person at this point in time. He became involved in the abolition of the slave trade after this. So his very first ever legal kind of victory was, like we said, involving Jonathan Strong, who was a slave that he had come across, quite badly injured, lying in the street. He'd been taken to London from Barbados, where he was working with a man called David Lyle. Now, David Lyle was his owner. He had beat him, hit him repeatedly, apparently with the bottom of a pistol, and left him for dead. When Granville Sharp saw him lying in the gutter and realised that he was very badly injured but alive, he was moved by the sort of sight of the man, and again, as a very religious person, he couldn't bear to see someone suffering such, even if it was a slave or a different colour than him, so he tried to help. And Strong took about 4 months to recover in hospital, and then Sharp gave him a job in London. And he was very happy to work for Granville Sharp. He did his best that he could to try and make Sharp happy, and Sharp realised that not only were these people exactly that, but they could also be taught to do other jobs other than just basic plantation work. And this makes him start to rethink slavery in general. Now, during this period, Strong's owner, Lyle, actually saw him in the street, and he paid 2 slave hunters to recapture Jonathan Strong and bring him back because he wanted to sell him to a different plantation owner. He didn't want him any longer, but he didn't obviously allow him to be free. When Strong obviously found out he was going to be sold back to the West Indies, back to the plantations, he asked Sharp for help, and Sharp agreed that he would, and the case eventually went to court. The Lord Mayor of London, who presided over the court, decided ultimately that Strong had not committed any crimes, so could not be held just because he was an ex-slave, and he was free to go. This was the very first time that a slave had ever won a court case in Britain, and it has a rather large knock-on effect. Now, Strong later dies from his injuries, but it's the point from there that Sharp starts to think, no, slaves are people, and the cruelty that he had witnessed under this just one example was being replicated by hundreds of other slave owners across the West Indies, and he thinks that this is something that he can make a definite change to and put a stop to. Eventually becomes the chairman of the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, and he was also involved in another famous ruling, in another famous court case, where it was decided what the actual law was. Now, this was called the Somerset Case in 1772, after another slave called James Somerset was brought to England. He was not beaten or anything the way that the original case was, but he did escape from his owners, and he went and got a job someplace else in London, and for 2 years he lived as a free man. After these 2 years, he was captured by slave hunters, and his owner tried to take him back to the West Indies to be put back on the plantations and obviously be punished there. Sharp, who had encountered Somerset and had worked with him and had given him a job, decided that he would take the case to court and decided that he would actually try to fight on behalf of Somerset to try and get him his freedom. At this point in time, the ruling justice, William Mansfield, stated that slave owners could not legally force slaves to return to the colonies once they were in Britain. And this ruling was a really huge step forward because it was regarded really as many as effectively abolishing slavery within Britain. So though you could be a slave and you could come to Britain, you could not, if you escaped or you were freed in Britain, you could not then be recaptured in Britain and forced to return to the colonies. Okay, so that's William Mansfield there. So this is a kind of a foundation point and quite a large move forward for these abolitionists, because they can actually see 2 occasions in law where slavery is starting to be stopped. Obviously, as a lawyer, Granville Sharp was a really key point to have on the anti-slavery team and was very important towards them ultimately being able to represent the anti-slavery campaign in Parliament with a lot of legal backing and cases that he had been involved in himself that were key to ultimate abolition happening in Britain. One of the other things that he also were involved in was this famous case of the Zong. He assisted Olade Equiano to show how horrible the Zong actually was and brought that to the public attention. He tried to actually have the ship crew convicted of murder, which unfortunately he was unsuccessful in doing. Ultimately they were found guilty of insurance fraud and were made to pay quite a hefty fine for that, but he could not make the jump between that and actual murder of these slaves, because ultimately they still were considered to be slaves. One of the other things Sharp became famous for was his idea of a free African state. And what he argued was they could make a state in Britain where any freed slaves could go to, and it was going to become known as the Province of Freedom. He sets this up, and it's actually estimated that about 1,500 freed black people actually came to live in Britain to be part of the Province of Freedom by the late 1700s. But the difficulty was it was hard for them to actually find work in Britain. Though some people did accept them, not everybody did, and it was difficult for them to get a job. A grant of £12 per passenger was then given to help cover the cost of travel for these people, and they were then sent back to Africa to try and rekindle kind of their lives and their connections to the country. Granville actually helped set up a settlement in what would be modern day Sierra Leone, which was called Granville Town. Okay, and that's kind of a artist depiction of Granville Town as it's being built, sort of a settlement there. Unfortunately, this idea of a utopia of freed slaves kind of went wrong, as one group who were sent there actually found that they couldn't maybe get as much money as they wanted. They were finding it very difficult to have trade with lots of people, so they did the only thing that they knew would definitely bring in money, and they started to resell the people in their settlement back into the slave trade, back to the Europeans who were trading with them. So ultimately, the impact that the slave trade has on Africa ultimately meant that these people going back to Africa still had to get involved in that if they wanted to survive. It was very difficult otherwise. So again, a little summary of Granville Sharp, and in particular some information about the Jonathan Strong case and the James Somerset case. Okay, again, feel free to pause this or go back and have a look at the other information to finish your table. Okay, so the next abolitionist that we're going on to look at is ThomasClarkson and his involvement in the slave trade. Next to William Wilberforce, Clarkson is probably the most famous, probably the most infamous in a lot of ways as well, of all of these people that were actually involved. So he was born in Cambridgeshire 1760. He went to Cambridge University, and while he was there, he wrote an essay that became quite famous. It won a prize, which was entitled, "Is it right to make men slaves against their will?" And in this he kind of starts to attack the idea of slavery in general. Now, Thomas Clarkson had come from a very well-off family. He was quite wealthy, and his family was originally Quakers, so again they would have been against slavery right from the very beginning because of their religious beliefs. He's a founding member of the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, and he becomes really important as the evidence gatherer. So, along with 10 others, including Granville Sharp, he creates the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade in 1786. He collects as much evidence as possible to show how bad the slave trade was. So this is things like recording interviews with captains, sailors, ex-traders, current traders, ex-slaves, everything like that. He visited the main ports, so Bristol, Liverpool, London as well, and he sees the ships that are in dock. He measures the spaces that each slave actually has inside, and he draws diagrams of all of these sort of things. He even brings things like leg irons, thumb screws, which you can see in that picture there, mouth openers, things that are used on slaves to actually show what is happening to them, including things like branding irons and things like that as well. One of the most famous examples of his work is in the drawing nicknamed The Print, which had been a drawing of the Liverpool ship the Brooks. Now, this ship showed, based on the law that we briefly talked about, that it could carry roughly about 450 slaves. But in truth, they often carried as many as about 609 to 700 at each time. So the diagram here you can see, which we have used kind of parts of, was the print that Thomas Clarkson did showing how tight packing and loose packing actually worked. And in this he showed how much space there actually was on the ship, how many slaves were being fit in, and did the calculation on how many of them would ultimately die. And he then did the same thing based on a loose packing model and showed the difference that this would actually make. So he's making this really clear for the people. He also publishes his evidence in books. He writes pamphlets and things like that and hands them out, a lot of the time outside of Parliament, where he is going and showing people, trying to give them pamphlets to show them these things. Generally because of what he was doing, he was not considered a very popular man in the slave trade ports. And during one visit in particular in Liverpool, he was actually attacked by a gang of men who tried to kill him by pushing him off the pier and into the sea. And they were able to obviously do that to him without much of an issue, with nobody kind of jumping in to help him, but he was able to fight them off and managed to escape. He got booed quite a lot whenever he tried to put things into Parliament, which was also one of the reasons why he was a very big advocate of involving William Wilberforce as a member of Parliament who could actually speak and be heard. Quite often historians have said that at the time no one actually worked harder than Clarkson in the campaign to ban the slave trade. He devoted time, energy, a lot of his money, most of his wealth into his work. However, he could not get people in Parliament to take him seriously, especially the ones that actually had any sort of real say. So this is where he starts to look for a member of Parliament to become a member of the anti-slavery group, the abolition group, and that's where his relationship with William Wilberforce actually starts to happen. Okay, again, just a nice wee summary of the things that we've said, which you can use if you want. Feel free to pause the video and have a look at that to fill in your table. Okay, so our next abolitionist is John Newton. Now, he becomes probably most famous not only for his involvement in the abolition group, but also because he is the composer of the song Amazing Grace, which he did as a way of actually explaining his experiences in the slave trade. So, John Newton was born in London in 1725. In 1744, like a lot of young men at this point in time, he joined the Navy and was transferred to a slave ship. His idea was to try and make his fortune. He quite quickly went up through the ranks until eventually he became a slave ship captain, until 1748, where a massive storm and a very near missed his life actually made him change his mind and his attitude about slavery and about the whole slave ship element. Ultimately, what happened was, during the storm, he was thrown off of the ship into the North Atlantic, and he was convinced that he was going to drown. However, he managed to survive. When he woke up on one of the nearby sort of islands, he found that he'd actually been saved and rescued by two of the slaves who had been on board the ship that he was the captain of. They had rescued him because obviously when the ship had gone down in the storm, they had managed to be freed, they'd gotten free, and they'd found him in the water and pulled him ashore. Now, for him, he saw this as an act of God. He saw this as God having saved him, and as a result of this, he had a huge religious awakening. So he decided he was going to become a minister. So he was ordained in 1764, and then he went on to become a vicar in London in 1780. And he became the vicar of St Mary's in Wool, North London, which is the name of the church that he was involved in. So he becomes involved in the abolition campaign in 1788 when he publishes a pamphlet which is made up of kind of his logs that he kept, detailed logs of the goings on as a slave ship captain, and it's called Thoughts Upon the African Slave Trade. Now, these logs have proved very useful to historians since this, but as a pamphlet he made it, sent it out, and the first copy sold out. A second copy was then republished, and it was sent out to every single member of Parliament in Britain. You can see a photo of what it actually looks like there. He then testified in the Privy Council, which was at a Parliament sort of meeting, and in other Parliament meetings, as well as preaching against the trade in his sermons with his church and with other people. In 1779, he wrote the hymn Amazing Grace, which he tried to kind of summarise all of his thoughts about the slave trade into. His sermons actually become really famous. People flock to see him and to hear him, and the song Amazing Grace becomes really famous as a result of that. Okay, again, just a little summary of the things that we've talked about regarding John Newton for you to use in your table or your mind map, whatever it is that you're doing. Again, pause the video, go back, replay some parts of it, make sure everything makes sense, and then we'll move on to look at Olada Equiano next. So, Olaudah Equiano is probably one of the most famous slaves or ex-slaves that we have discussed in this topic. He was obviously kidnapped as a child and was sold into slavery. Eventually he becomes a slave to a ship's captain. We don't know roughly exactly where he was born, but we know that he must have been born about 1745, and quite often he talked about being quite important in his actual village where he came from, in his tribe. He talks about his father being a chief or being involved in the kind of royalty element of things. So we know that he must have been quite important wherever it was he was actually born. He's one of the very few slaves that we have on record who managed to buy their freedom. He did this in 1767, which was roughly about £40 is what was paid for him, which he managed to scrape together and save. He said he spent about 20 years actually saving this money. Roughly that's about £2,500 today in today's currency. But his owner was a man of his word and had promised that if he'd managed to make this money, then he would set him free. As a free man, he becomes involved in the abolition movement. He comes to Britain and he works with individuals like Granville Sharp, travels around Britain working with people like ThomasClarkson, speaking at meetings against slavery and against the slave trade. Eventually, he publishes a book called The Interesting Life of Olaudah Equiano in 1789. Here's what it looks like here. You can actually buy a copy if you're interested on Amazon. I think it's about £3 to buy a copy. But in this book, it tells not only the account by an African person, but also the horrors of what the slave trade was actually like. It's a very frank, personal experience of being a slave. He doesn't hold back anything from it. He tells exactly how his experience actually was. And overnight it becomes a bestseller with people around the UK really, really interested in buying it or interested in hearing him speak. Now, in particular in the UK, literacy rates are not very high, so not everyone can actually read, but a lot of the wealthy people, the ones that are very much trying to become involved in some sort of social charity work and things like that, and especially females, were really interested in hearing this story, and then they would talk about it with other people. So it becomes a bestseller, and he goes on to do kind of a tour around that and things as well. He also sets up his own individual group known as the Sons of Africa, which was a group of 12 other ex-slaves who were campaigning for abolition. So they worked alongside the campaign for the abolition of the slave trade in Britain. So just again, some more information, some of it that we've already talked about, some of it that we haven't. Which you can then put into your table or your mind map, whatever you're doing for Olaudah Equiano. Okay, the next two, Josiah Wedgwood and James Ramsey, we're going to put in as just one table. Okay, so information about both of them would go into this. So for this you maybe want to use a different colour, one for Josiah and one for James. Okay, whatever you want to do with that, or maybe write the information in and then highlight them or draw around them in a different colour, whatever you want to do so that it stands out a little bit. Now the reason we're putting these two together is because they are actually quite important for us knowing about these kind of 8 key players in the slave trade's abolition, but they're not as important as some of the other ones that we've actually talked about. So Josiah Wedgwood was born in Staffordshire in 1730, and he was a famous potter. And one of the main things that he does in the whole abolition campaign, which sometimes gets overlooked is that he designed the wax seal, which helped the campaign in a lot of ways. He's the one that designs this kind of image that they would use on their pamphlets, on their posters. You would have people who were involved in the slave trade putting it on to documents, into pots and pottery and things like that. They would sometimes even have them on dinner plates and things, so that once a dinner party was finished, you would see the symbol and it would spark a conversation at the dinner table and things like that. He was a friend of ThomasClarkson, and it was Clarkson that brought him into the abolition meeting, and then William Wilberforce who asked him to make the seal. It's possibly one of the most famous images in the slave trade topic, which you can see here. The "Am I Not a Man and Brother" seal makes a huge impression. It kind of stands for abolition. Everything that abolition stood for was summarised in this one image, which he then broadcast everywhere. Like we said, copies of it start to appear on brooches, on lids of snuff boxes, on documents, pretty much everywhere they possibly could. And every time that this seal was sold and he earned a little bit of money, he put that money into the actual movement. So he funded or helped to fund part of the slave abolition movement. He also took an active role in their other efforts to publicise the cause. He produced and printed pamphlets. He bought spaces in newspapers for them to put things in. He organised petitions. He tried to pay some newspaper writers to actually come to demonstrations and to speeches and things, and to write about it in positive light and things like that as well. So a little bit more information about Josiah Wedgwood there, okay, which we've kind of gone through. The bit at the bottom is about James Ramsey. He was a slave ship doctor, okay, in the Navy, and he'd kind of witnessed the suffering firsthand. In particular, in 1759, while he was stationed in the West Indies, he saw a slave ship, the Swift, approaching and asking for help because it had been struck down with a very severe case of dysentery, and a lot of the slaves and the crew were actually dead. As the only doctor around, he treated about 100 people who were packed close together in what he considered and described in a book later on as the most inhuman and filthy conditions that he had ever encountered. He then later on publishes an inquiry into the effects of putting a stop to the African slave trade in 1784. After this experience, you can see a picture of it there. And these are the very first times that basically anti-slavery works start to be published and read by anyone that was not an actual slave. People that had actually seen the suffering. Okay, so if you go back and you fill in some information about each one, feel free just to use the summary here for each one, Josiah Wedgwood and James Ramsey, and then we'll look at the very last abolitionist that we have to look at, which is Hanna Mer. Now, she's one of the only females that we're talking about in this part of the topic. Okay, and again, not an awful lot of information about her, because though she is important, she's not maybe as important as some of the key players that we've looked at in a little bit more detail. So she was a teacher who became a writer. She'd been a friend of William Wilberforce and John Newton, and through them and listening to John Newton's sermons in particular, she became an active anti-slavery member as well. She helped give the abolition movement a public voice. So in 1788 she wrote a poem called Slavery, a poem, to coincide with the parliamentary campaign for abolition that William Wilberforce planned to kick off. The poem pretty much described all of the enslaved people, the mistreated females who were separated from their children, and it questioned the role that Britain actually played in the slave trade as almost this kidnapper or the separate entity that was taking mothers and children away from each other. Now in particular, what she does is she targets the female anti sort of slavery people, the ones that are really starting to think that maybe this isn't good. She tries to invoke emotions within them to convince them that slavery is wrong, making them question about how they would actually feel if it was their children being taken away, and it has a really profound impact on these particular women in society, and they will then later on start to become more involved as she starts off one of the biggest methods that the abolitionists used, which was the sugar boycott. So she encourages the women of Britain to boycott sugar. Many of them persuading sort of grocers and things like that to stop selling any sugar that was produced by slaves at this point in time, just to stop buying it in general, only buying sugar that was coming from India or non-slavery based plantations. By 1792, there's 300,000 people boycotting slave-produced sugar in grocers in Britain at this point in time, and their sales have dropped quite dramatically. So they stop stocking it. They refuse to buy it. They start to buy more in from India and these other places, and effectively what they do is they show the power of just the normal people going to the shops and buying things, and how that could be really important towards the trade. Okay, so now that you've got information about each of your people, and again, go back, fill in your tables or your mind maps, whatever it is you're doing, what I want you to do is think about, who do you think is actually your most important people? Out of these particular people that we're talking about, these 8 people, who are your top 4? So what you can either do is you can draw a pyramid in your jotter, or you can just write it out. It's entirely up to you. But what I want you to do is decide who your first, second, third and fourth placed abolitionists are in terms of importance, and just beside each one, so write their name, and then beside each one just write down one sentence why you think that.